All right, Adam, let's we can't get through a podcast without talking about New York, so let me kick it to you and what's going on over there.
And really, would you want to? No, I mean, you want to talk New York. The first bids for mobile sports betting in New York are due on Monday. There was another round of Q&A released by the New York State Gaming Commission. Really didn't dive too far into anything else. We didn't learn a whole lot about what is expected of operators. And as Dustin and I chatted about a little bit last week, the most fascinating part of all of this is when the bids finally are viewed in some way, shape, or form to see what sort of sportsbook Voltron has come together to try to put in for one of these super bids, because we've heard so many rumors now about sportsbooks and platforms coming together in order to place a bid with this expected north of 50%, 55, 60% revenue share to be offered to the state of New York. One more thing to add in about this, and this has been brought up in a few places, and I think Dustin's dealt with it on Twitter, and we actually wrote about this when Andrew Cuomo's scandals first began. The report that came out from the New York Attorney General yesterday has led some people to ask us, well, what happens to mobile sports betting in New York if Cuomo resigns? And the answer is nothing. This has been passed. This is in law. This is in the budget. They're not going to go back and change anything now just because Cuomo is gone, and Cuomo is the driving force behind the idea of having a state-run monopoly on sportsbook. Like, this is done. It could potentially, if Cuomo were not there, mean that the timeline to go back and redo something in future years is shortened. But keep in mind that the bidding process right now rewards sportsbooks for larger revenue share with longer-term licenses. And so if someone's going to be granted a 10-year license at certain terms, you might be looking at the state of New York saying, you know what? This works pretty well for us. It might take underperformance in some way for them to be willing to go and say, all right, we're going to try to change this up.
Dustin, that is not the only New York news that we have coming out this week. What do we have in the DFS world?
I mean, this is like throwback year. We're talking about DFS and laws and kind of wild. This is what we were doing back in 2015 and 16. But the case that has been around for a long time about the legality of the DFS law that New York passed back in 2016. There's a court case that started back then, soon after that law got passed, and two different courts along the way in New York have deemed the law that they passed to be against the Constitution, and that basically that we learn now is that this is finally being heard at the final appeal stop in New York, and there's a court date set in October for this to start getting heard. So this is we're now to the end game of this 5 years later, but we've been writing about this story for a long time. But the really interesting dynamic here is if DraftKings and FanDuel, or if actually the state of New York loses this case, because they're the ones defending it as they pass this law, and they have to say, they're defending the law that they can regulate and legalize DFS. The end game is that DraftKings and FanDuel and anybody else who was operating in New York, in theory, would have to pull out for daily fantasy sports, but we also believe and think that DraftKings and FanDuel are likely to be the sports betting operators in New York. That would be a wild scenario that we're seeing here in 2021, where DraftKings, FanDuel can operate sports betting, can operate DFS, and as you know, and I like to speculate, that whole law was basically the turning point for DraftKings and FanDuel. That didn't happen. We are not sitting here probably talking about both of those brands being number one and number two in U.S. sports betting. There's some question about whether one or both of those companies would still be in existence without that New York law, because if you recall or not up to speed, that was breathed life into legalization efforts across the country. If they had to pull out of New York, their revenue would have decreased immensely in the short term back in 2016. So it's a wild scenario, but who knows? Going back to Adam and the point about that, it doesn't affect sports betting or what's going on there, especially the Cuomo stuff. But it is also wild to think about Cuomo. If they had waited on this bill, they're doing this to appease. Somehow Cuomo is leveraging a lot of power still in the budget process, and basically got the sports betting plan that he wanted. If they had waited, maybe we would have gotten a better sports betting plan. But that's all, like Adam says, that's water under the bridge. We are where we are. So the hope is that without Cuomo in power, there's a possibility to revise the law in the future. if that happens. I mean, as we're sitting here, who knows? He is still in power and has not resigned, but it's increasingly looking difficult for him to survive the process here.
Certainly does look like that might not be the case by the time we record next week.